I was stretching the last surveyed line across 640 acres of Wyoming grassland when the roar hit from above. Dust exploded around me as a helicopter descended its rotors, whipping the air into chaos. Before the skids touched ground, a woman in a black suit jumped out, waving a document like a weapon. "Stop immediately," she shouted over the engine noise. "This is federal land." But I knew it wasn't. My father had died on this property 5 years ago, heart attack while fixing the fence line alone in the cold. "The deed in my cabin," said Branson. The will said mine. And yet here she was, Fiona Kellerman, chief legal officer for a corporation I'd never heard of, telling me I had no right to be here. What I didn't know then was that beneath this dirt lay something worth millions. And my father hadn't died of natural causes. The morning had started quiet. I'd driven out from the cabin at first light GPS unit clipped to my belt. Steel stakes rattling in the truck bed. The Wind River Range sat blue and distant on the western horizon. Snow still clinging to the peaks even in late May. 640 acres. That's what the deed said. That's what my father had left me when his heart gave out 5 years back alone on this same stretch of land, wrench still in his hand from repairing a gate hinge. I hadn't been back since the funeral. I couldn't stomach it. But now I was 38, burned out from 12 years of geological consulting for oil companies. And this inheritance felt like the only solid thing left in my life. I wanted boundaries. I wanted to mark what was mine. The land rolled gently here, covered in buffalo grass and sage, interrupted by occasional outcrops of Precambrian granite. Old ranching country. My grandfather had bought it in the 50s, back when you could still get acreage cheap if you were willing to live far from anything resembling civilization. My father had kept cattle for a while, then just horses, then nothing. He died keeping the fences intact out of pure stubbornness, I think. Now those fences were rotted posts and rusted wire, and I was here to do what he never finished. I hammered the first survey stake at the southwestern corner, right where the county cadastral map said the property line began. The ground was hard. It took 6 hits with the sledge to sink the steel deep enough to hold. I was halfway down the southern boundary when I heard it. A low thrum that didn't belong to the wind. I looked up and saw nothing but blue sky. Then the sound grew louder, sharper, mechanical. The helicopter came in fast from the east, black against the sun, dropping altitude as it approached. For a moment, I thought it might be medical, some rancher hurt miles away, but it angled directly toward me. The noise became deafening. I stepped back from the surveyed line as the chopper descended 20 yards in front of me, rotors churning the dry soil into a blinding cloud. I covered my face with my arms, squinting through the dust. The skids hadn't even settled when the door slid open, and a woman in a black pantsuit stepped out, one hand holding a folder, the other shielding her eyes. She walked straight at me, not waiting for the rotors to slow. Her hair was pulled back tight, graying at the temples, and her expression was the kind of professional cold you see in corporate lawyers who bill by the quarter hour. She stopped 5 feet away and raised her voice over the helicopter noise. "Stop immediately," she said, holding up a document printed on an official-looking letterhead. "This land is under federal jurisdiction. You are trespassing." I stared at her, then at the paper. The wind from the rotors made it flutter in her grip, but I could see the Bureau of Land Management logo at the top and below it a cease and desist order with my name typed in bold. Cole Branson. That was me. But the rest made no sense. I pulled the folded deed from my jacket pocket and held it up. "This is my property," I said loud enough to carry over the engine. "My father bought it in 1987. I have the title." She glanced at the paper in my hand, but didn't reach for it. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. "That deed has a problem, Mr. Branson," she said. "A significant legal problem. I suggest you contact an attorney before proceeding further." She handed me the cease and desist, and I took it without thinking, still trying to process what was happening. "Who are you?" I asked. "Fiona Kellerman," she said. "Chief Legal Officer for Wind River Resources. We've filed a quiet title action to reclaim this land on behalf of the federal government. You'll be served formally within the week." Then she turned and walked back to the helicopter without waiting for a response. I stood there holding 2 pieces of paper, one in each hand, as the chopper lifted off. The dust settled slowly, coating my boots and jeans. The surveyor's tape I'd strung between stakes flapped uselessly in the rotor wash. I looked down at the cease and desist order. It cited a 1985 boundary error, claimed that 640 acres had been mistakenly deeded to private ownership when it should have remained federal land, and demanded I halt all construction, fencing, or improvement activities immediately. Failure to comply, it said, could result in civil and criminal penalties. I read it twice. None of it made sense. My father had owned this land for 37 years. He'd paid taxes on it. He'd built the cabin, run livestock, and maintained the access road. If there had been a problem with the deed, someone would have said something decades ago. I walked back to the truck and sat in the cab with the door open, staring out at the land. The silence felt heavier now. I could see the cabin in the distance, a small square of weathered logs against the hillside. My father had lived there alone for the last 15 years of his life after my mother passed. He called me once a month, always brief, always asking if I was eating right and sleeping enough. He never mentioned trouble with the land. Never mentioned anyone challenging his ownership. But I remembered something he'd said the last time I visited 2 months before he died. We'd been standing near the fence line, and he'd looked out at the mountains and said, "This place is worth more than people know, Cole. If anyone ever asks about it, don't trust them." I thought he was being paranoid. Old man talks. Now I wasn't sure. I drove back to the cabin and parked in the gravel turnaround. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was exactly as I'd left it after the funeral, sparse and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a narrow bed in the corner. On the shelf above the stove sat a wooden box I'd never opened, sealed with a small brass latch. My father's papers. I'd packed them here after sorting through his effects, meaning to deal with them later, but later had turned into 5 years. I lifted the box down and set it on the table. The latch opened with a soft click. Inside were the deed, the will, a stack of tax receipts, and a manila envelope with my name written on the outside in my father's careful handwriting. Beneath my name and smaller letters he'd written, "Only open if someone asks about the land." I held the envelope for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. My hands were still dusty from the survey work. Through the window, I could see the survey stakes I'd planted that morning. Small, bright markers against the grass. Beyond them, the empty horizon. I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed. Monroe Ellis, my father's attorney. He'd handled the will, the probate, everything. If anyone knew what this cease and desist was about, it would be him. I dialed. It rang 4 times before he picked up. "Monroe Ellis speaking," he said, his voice growly and tired. "Mr. Ellis," I said, "it's Cole Branson. I need to talk to you about my father's land." There was a pause on the other end long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he sighed. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. "How soon can you get to my office?" I looked out the window again. The sun was past noon, casting short shadows. In the distance, I saw something that made me stop. Lights, small and faint, moving slowly across the far edge of the property near the northern boundary. Vehicle headlights maybe, or work lamps. Someone was out there. "I'm coming now," I told Monroe, still watching the lights. I'll be there in an hour. I hung up and stood at the window tracking the movement. They were too far away to identify, but they were deliberate, methodical, sweeping back and forth like a search pattern. I thought about the woman in the black suit, the way she'd looked at the ground before she walked back to the helicopter. Not at me, at the land itself, like she was measuring something. I grabbed my jacket and the envelope still sealed and headed for the truck. The lights on the northern boundary kept moving. Monroe Ellis kept his office above a hardware store on Main Street in Pinedale, the kind of place where the stairs creaked and the coffee was always burnt. I'd been there once before 5 years ago to sign the probate papers. The waiting room smelled the same, like old carpet and paper dust. Monroe appeared in the doorway before I could sit down, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Come in, Cole," he said quietly. His handshake felt weaker than I remembered. He was 68 now, white hair thinning, shoulders hunched forward like he'd spent too many years bent over contracts. We sat across from each other at his desk, and I slid the cease and desist order across the worn oak surface. He picked it up, read it, and set it down without comment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a file folder marked Branson Travis in faded ink. "Your father warned me this might happen," Monroe said. He tapped him the folder with one finger. "Back in 2010, someone made an offer on his land. 3 times market value, cash deal, no inspection, close in 30 days. Your father turned them down flat. A week later, another offer came. Same terms, different buyer. He turned that one down too. Then the call started, anonymous, late at night, asking if he'd reconsidered, asking what it would take. He told me he thought someone knew something about the land he didn't." Monroe paused, looking at me over his reading glasses. I told him he was being paranoid. I was wrong. He pulled a document from the file, a photocopy of a legal complaint. This was filed in 2008. A company called Wind River Resources tried to claim that 320 acres of your father's land was federal property improperly deeded. The court dismissed it for lack of evidence. No appeal was ever filed until now. I leaned forward studying the complaint. The plaintiff was listed as Wind River Resources LLC Incorporated in Delaware. No physical address. "What do they want with this land?" I asked. Monroe shrugged, but his expression said he had theories. Could be minerals, uranium deposits in this area. Natural gas, could be water rights, could be nothing, and they're just fishing. But your father didn't think it was nothing. He started acting strange after that lawsuit got dismissed, checking his fence lines every day, keeping records of every vehicle that drove past. He told me once that if anything happened to him, I should make sure you knew the land was yours, free and clear, legally yours. He said it 3 times, like he was trying to convince himself. I thought about my father alone in that cabin watching headlights on distant roads, marking down license plates in a notebook I'd probably thrown away. "I need to see the full chain of titles," I said from the beginning. Monroe nodded and stood moving to a filing cabinet in the corner. It took him 10 minutes to pull everything, spreading the documents across his desk in chronological order. The earliest was a land patent from 1952 signed by the Secretary of the Interior granting 640 acres to my grandfather, William Branson. After that came the transfer to my father in 1979, then the deed revision in 1987. I stopped at that one. "Why was the deed revised?" I asked. Monroe frowned. "I don't know. It was before my time. But look at the signature." He pointed to the bottom of the page. "Deputy Director, Bureau of Land Management, Federal Official." That's unusual for a private land transfer. Usually, it's just county recorder stamps. This had federal oversight. "We need to go to the county clerk's office," I said. I want to see the original documents, not copies. Monroe checked his watch. They close in 2 hours. We can make it if we leave now. He grabbed his coat, and we took his car, a 15-year-old sedan that smelled like old coffee and leather. The Sublette County clerk sat in a low brick building near the courthouse, staffed by a woman named Janet, who had worked there for 30 years. Monroe knew her by name. "We need to pull a complete title history," he told her. "Branson Property, Section 12, Township 32. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a cardboard box full of ledgers and microfilm reels. "Everything's being digitized," she said, "but the old stuff is still on paper. You'll need the reading room." The reading room was a windowless space with a microfilm reader and a long table. Monroe and I spread out the documents working backward from 2024. Tax records, surveys, easements, water rights. Everything looked normal until we hit 2008. There it was. The quiet title action Monroe had mentioned. Wind River Resources LLC versus Travis Branson. The complaint alleged that a boundary survey conducted in 1985 had been conducted in error, and that the western 320 acres of the Branson property actually fell within federal land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The court had dismissed the case in 2009, ruling that Wind River Resources failed to provide sufficient evidence of federal ownership. But the case file included something else, a motion to seal certain exhibits granted by the judge. Whatever evidence they tried to submit was locked away. I sat back staring at the motion. "Why would they seal evidence in a case they'd lost?" I asked. Monroe shook his head slowly. "The only reason I can think of is they didn't want it on public record. Whatever they had, it was sensitive enough to bury." I thought about the envelope in my truck, still unopened. My father's warning, only opened if someone asks about the land. Someone was asking now. I stood up. "I need to check something." Monroe looked up from the documents. "What?" "I'll tell you after I read it," I said. We finished at the clerk's office just before closing, making copies of everything we could. Monroe drove me back to my truck parked outside his office. "Call me after you read whatever it is," he said. "I will." I told him I meant it. The drive back to the cabin took 40 minutes. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the grass. I parked and sat in the cab for a moment, looking at the envelope on the passenger seat, my father's handwriting, careful block letters. I opened it. Inside were 3 items. First, a photocopy of an agreement dated October 1985 between the Bureau of Land Management and Travis Branson. The language was bureaucratic and dense, but the meaning was clear. The BLM acknowledged that a survey error had resulted in 640 acres of federal land being mistakenly deeded to William Branson in 1952. In exchange for Travis Branson's silence regarding the error, the BLM agreed to allow the Branson family to retain ownership in perpetuity with no back taxes or penalties. The agreement was signed by a deputy director named Everett Thornton. Beneath his signature, someone had stamped confidential in red ink. The second item was a letter handwritten by my father dated 6 months before he died. It was addressed to me. "Cole," it read, "if you're reading this, someone has come asking about the land. Don't trust them." The agreement I made in '85 was legal, but it was also secret. The BLM didn't want anyone knowing they'd made a mistake that big. I kept quiet because they let me keep the land. But there's something under this ground they want. I don't know what. Uranium maybe, or rare earth minerals. Whatever it is, they'll try to take it back now that I'm gone. The land is yours. Fight for it. You're smarter than I ever was. Use that. Your father. I read it 3 times, feeling the weight of words written by a man who knew he might not live to explain them in person. The third item was a business. Faded edges worn. Everett Thornton, Deputy Director, Bureau of Land Management. A phone number was written on the back and pencil along with a note. Call if trouble comes. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. It rang twice, then a recorded message. The number you have reached is no longer in service. I tried again. Same result. I sat at the kitchen table as the light faded outside, staring at the agreement. My father had kept this secret for 39 years. He'd paid taxes on land the federal government knew wasn't supposed to be his, and someone at the BLM had signed off on it, burying the mistake to avoid embarrassment or scandal or something worse. Now, that agreement was the only thing standing between me and a corporation that wanted this land badly enough to send a helicopter. I thought about Fiona Kellerman's face the way she looked at the ground. Not at me, at what was beneath. I opened my laptop and searched for Wind River Resources LLC. The company website was generic. Mining and mineral acquisition, sustainable resource development, a board of directors with no photos. I dug deeper, running searches through state business registries. Wind River Resources was incorporated in Delaware in 2007. Its parent company was registered in the Cayman Islands. Its majority stakeholder was a holding group with ties to a Chinese mining conglomerate specializing in rare earth elements. I sat back, understanding clicking into place. Rare earth elements, neodymium, praseodymium, lanthanum, used in batteries, magnets, electronics worth billions, and my father's land sat on top of them. I heard an engine outside, headlights swept across the cabin wall. I stood and moved to the window, staying back from the glass. A black SUV rolled slowly past on the access road, then stopped 200 yards out. The headlights cut off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the interior light came on, briefly illuminating two figures in the front seats. One of them raised something to their face. Binoculars, maybe, or a camera. They were watching the cabin. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the vehicle, zooming in as much as I could. The license plate was obscured by mud. After 5 minutes, the SUV started again and drove away, heading north toward the boundary where I had seen the lights earlier. I saved the photo and called Monroe. It went to voicemail. "Monroe," I said. I read the envelope. "We need to talk tomorrow morning. Your office. This is bigger than a land dispute." I hung up and locked the door. Something I'd never bothered with before. Outside, the land stretched dark and empty under a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, people were measuring, surveying, planning. My father had died keeping this place. Now I understand why. Monroe called me back at 6 o'clock in the morning. His voice was tight. "Urgent." "I found someone who can help," he said. Heron Pierce. He was the surveyor who did the boundary work in 1985. He's 71 now, and lives at Aspen Valley Care Center in Rock Springs. I'm driving down today. You should come. I was already pulling on my boots. I'll meet you there in 2 hours. The drive south took me through empty country, past ranches that looked abandoned, and towns that barely qualified as crossroads. Rock Springs sat in a basin surrounded by red rock, industrial and worn. The care center was a single-story building on the east side, beige stucco, with a parking lot full of sedans that had seen better decades. Monroe was waiting by his car when I pulled in. We signed in at the front desk and followed a nurse down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and boiled vegetables. She stopped at room 117 and knocked softly before opening the door. "Mr. Pierce, you have visitors." The man sitting in the chair by the window was thin, his hands trembling slightly as he set down a newspaper. He looked at Monroe first, then at me, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or fear. "I knew you'd come," he said quietly. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much anymore. "I knew someone would come eventually." Monroe pulled 2 chairs over, and we sat. Mr. Pierce, this is Cole Branson, Travis's son. The old man nodded slowly. You look like him. Same eyes. I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man. Better than he needed to be. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm. I need to know what happened in 1985. The boundary survey. The agreement with the BLM. Why my father's land was suddenly a mistake. Pierce looked down at his hands. The trim are worse now. They made me do it 3 times, he said. 3 times. The first survey was clean, accurate, 640 acres, all private land deeded proper in 52. But then someone from the BLM showed up, said there had been an error in the original land patent, said I needed to resurvey using different reference points. I told them the survey was fine, but they insisted. So I did it again. Same result. Then they brought in their own team, federal surveyors, and suddenly the boundaries shifted west. 320 acres that had been private for 30 years were now federal. Monroe was writing notes, his pen scratching across a legal pad. Who ordered the resurvey? He asked. Pierce closed his eyes, remembering Deputy Director from the BLM Cheyenne office. Thornon. Everett Thornon. He flew down in person, bringing geologists with him. They were taking soil samples, checking outcrops, and marking coordinates. I asked what they were looking for. He said it was routine verification. But it wasn't routine. They found something. I could tell by the way they talked when they thought I wasn't listening. Rare earth elements, deposits big enough to matter, and they were all on the Branson property. The government had given away land worth millions by mistake, and they wanted it back. I felt something cold settle in my chest. So, they just redrew the lines, I said. Pierce nodded. They offered your father a deal. The BLM would quietly acknowledge the survey error and let him keep the land if he agreed never to disclose the rare earth deposits or the agreement. In exchange, if he ever sold the land, the BLM would get first refusal at fair market value. Your father agreed. He didn't have much choice. Fighting the federal government costs money and time, and he had neither. So Thornton drew up the confidential agreement, filed it somewhere. No one would find it, and everyone moved on. Except the land was always a target. I stopped doing surveys after that. I couldn't stomach it. The government had turned me into a liar. Monroe tapped his pen against the pad. Do you have any documentation from that time? Anything that could verify this? Pierce shook his head. They took everything. All my field notes, my calculations. The original survey maps said it was federal property, now part of the record. But I remember. I remember every stake I drove, every measurement I took. That land was private. Still is legally. The agreement says so. But now someone wants to break that agreement, don't they? It wasn't a question. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo of the black SUV from last night. Have you ever seen this vehicle? I asked. Or anyone matching this description? I described Fiona Kellerman, the helicopter, the cease and desist order. Pierce studied the photo and shook his head. No, but if they're already watching you, it means they're serious. And if they're serious, they'll use everything they have to push you off that land. We left the care center 20 minutes later, stepping into the midday heat. Monroe looked shaken. We need a private investigator, he said. Someone who can dig into Wind River resources, find out who's really behind this. I know someone, I said, from my old job. Former military intelligence. She's good? Monroe nodded. Hire her. I'll start drafting a response to the cease and desist. We'll fight this procedurally, step by step. But Cole, you need to be ready. These people aren't just trying to take your land. They're trying to rewrite history. And they have resources we don't. I watched a semi roll past on the highway, trailing diesel exhaust. They have resources, I said, but they don't have the truth. Not yet. Monroe gave me a long look. Let's hope that's enough. I called the investigator from the parking lot. Her name was Delaney Grant, 34, sharp as a blade. We'd worked together on a mineral rights case in North Dakota 3 years back. She answered on the second ring. Cole Branson, she said, I thought you retired. I did, I said. Now I need your help. I gave her the summary. The land, the cease and desist, Wind River Resources, the 1985 agreement. She was silent for a moment, processing. Rare earth elements, she said finally. That's Chinese interest written all over it. Give me 3 days. I'll trace the LLC back to its source and find out who's funding this. What's your budget? Whatever it takes, I said. This is my family's land. She made a sound that might have been approval. I'll call you when I have something. She hung up. The drive back to Pinedale took longer than it should have. I stopped twice, checking my mirrors for the black SUV. It never appeared. But when I pulled into the cabin's driveway just after sunset, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The front door was ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. I parked and approached slowly, scanning the area. No vehicles, no movement. I pushed the door open with my foot. The interior had been torn apart. Drawers pulled out, cushions sliced open, the wood stoves. Ash scattered across the floor. They'd gone through everything, methodical and deliberate. The box of my father's papers was gone. So was my laptop. But they'd left the furniture intact, the windows unbroken. This wasn't theft. It was intimidation. A message. I walked through the cabin, cataloging the damage. In the bedroom, they dumped the mattress and emptied the closet. In the kitchen, every cabinet hung open, but they hadn't found what mattered. The envelope from my father, the agreement, the letter, Thornton's business card. I'd taken all of it with me to Rock Springs. It was still in my truck, tucked under the seat. I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff. The dispatcher said someone would be out in an hour. I sat on the front step and waited, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere to the north, I saw headlights again, moving in that same slow search pattern. They were still out there, still measuring, still planning. My father had lived here alone for 15 years, and they'd waited until he was gone to make their move. Now they were waiting for me to break, to walk away, to accept their version of history. The sheriff arrived 90 minutes later, a deputy with a camera and a clipboard. He took photos, asked questions, and wrote down my answers. Probably kids, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Or someone looking for cash valuables. You should stay somewhere else tonight. Get the door fixed tomorrow. I nodded, but didn't answer. After he left, I locked what was left of the door and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. My phone buzzed. A text from Monroe. Received a letter today. Wind River Resources attorney. They're filing a formal quiet title action next week.